Ezekiel is probably most famous for the different visions that are the pillars of the book. The opening vision in chapters 1 to 3, where we have a big thunderstorm coming and Ezekiel sees a reflection of the glory of God. And then the vision in chapters 8 to 11, where he sees the glory of God departing from Jerusalem. And then the final vision, the final 9 chapters of the book, where he sees the glory of God return to Jerusalem, to a new Jerusalem in which God is present again. So it's about God's presence that tells us already, the 3 visions tell us that it is about God's presence and absence. The other vision, which doesn't quite fit in with those 3 glory of God visions, but is possibly even more famous, is the vision of the valley of the dry bones, them dry bones that have inspired spirituals and have inspired the first sort of painting from Ezekiel in the 3rd century in a synagogue in Dura Europos in Syria. We have one wall that depicts that vision of bones coming to life. Now, if we look more closely at chapter 37, I think that gives us an entry point into the book. We start and observe immediately that there's something that is quite similar to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah already talked about the bones. In Jeremiah 8, we have a prophecy that goes roughly along the lines of, "Thus says the Lord, look, the bones of the kings of Judah, the bones of its officials, the bones of the priests, the bones of the prophets, the bones of all the inhabitants of Jerusalem shall be taken out of the graves, put on the floor, exposed to sun, moon, and the hosts of heaven, whom they have worshipped, and they shall dry and rot there and fertilize the land." And that's basically the prophecy in Jeremiah. And characteristically, for the relationship between Jeremiah and Ezekiel, is that we've got a little bit in Jeremiah, which then becomes something big in Ezekiel. It becomes a whole vision of Ezekiel being led around and observing these bones and then prophesying, participating in that vision, and seeing those bones come to life. But it's not just an echo of Jeremiah, but also an echo of what the people said at those times. They're quoted towards the end of that vision as saying, "Our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We're completely cut off." Now, the question is, why would they say something like that? And that makes us think about the background of the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was among those who were deported in 597 by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who came there to punish Judah for their rebellion against him. And it was, in fact, judging by the numbers we're given in Jeremiah, the biggest deportation of them all. He took the leading people of Judah, and particularly Jerusalem, priests, scribes, and so on, resettled them in Babylon in different places, and one of them was at a canal near the Nippur, and Ezekiel was part of that community, and he used these exiles to rebuild his own territory back in Babylon. There's no doubt partly to have some hostages so that the people back in Jerusalem would behave themselves, because if they don't, he's got lots of their family members there in Babylon. So this was in 597. And about 4 years later, he had this opening vision. And it's all responding, to start with, the ministry is in that period of time between the deportation of a large part of the leading figures of Jerusalem and before the destruction of Jerusalem. And then a later part of his ministry is once Jerusalem has been destroyed, the news arrive in Babylon of that destruction, and they ask, "What now? Our hope is lost. It's all gone now." That wasn't actually the view they had in 593 at the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry. That is reflected later on when they realized that Jerusalem has been destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar was successful. So what's the response to that situation in the book of Ezekiel? In that vision itself, it's a vision that looks like resurrection. First we have the bones that come together, flesh, sinews, then they are alive, and it's explained in a prophecy as, "I will open the tombs and they will come out of their tombs." And it's a picture of resurrection. But of course it isn't really about resurrection. It's interesting that one of the first more detailed passages about resurrection that we have in the Bible, actually uses the imagery of physical resurrection to talk about something else. It's not really about physical resurrection. It is, as the prophecy goes on to explain, about a resettlement of the exilic community in the land. It's about God making a new start, bringing life out of death, making a new start with the people that he had deported into Babylon, bringing them back into the land, resettling them, re-establishing a nation. And it's such an incredible thing to happen that the only picture that will do for it is one of physical resurrection, the resurrection of dead bodies to life. But as I said, that's not really the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry. The beginning of Ezekiel's ministry is a bit different. And I think even that is reflected in the vision in Ezekiel 37. Because one of the really striking things about that coming to life is that it takes place in two stages. So there are these dry bones. Ezekiel is being led around and he's asked to prophesy an amazing vision, one that a prophet doesn't just see but participates in. He speaks the word, the wind comes to those bones, and flesh and sinew comes on them, but they're still dead. Dead bodies. Instead of dead bones, they are now dead bodies. And it has to be another prophetic word. Ezekiel is asked again to prophesy, and the Spirit comes again, and now life comes into these bodies, and they stand up, and they are like an army, ready and fully alive again. So why two stages? There's a lot of debate about that, of course. There's some people who say, well, it's in order to concede just how difficult that effort is. Well, there may be something to that. But of course, the point of the vision is not least that God is able to do it. There may be an allusion back to Genesis. Genesis, the creation of the first human being from earth in two stages, really. First, the creation of the body, and then breathing life into it. And I think that is certainly one reason why it is phrased like that, to allude back to that story. But why make the allusion? It doesn't really give us the answer yet. And I think the answer is that there's something being said about the nature of prophecy here. And that's something that's quite complex in the Hebrew as well, in the way that what is unusual is that Ezekiel features in that vision as an active participant. But if you look at the syntax of the Hebrew, whatever he does is actually put offline the main action. So on the one hand, his ministry is emphasized because he actually participates in the vision. On the other hand, syntactically, it's downplayed. And it's like the prophetic word becomes something independent of himself. And an interesting word is used for prophesying later on, a verb form that is usually used for people play-acting prophecy. Again, something that I think emphasizes the independence of the prophetic word from the prophet. So what's going on there, in my view, is that the vision itself says that Ezekiel's ministry comes in two stages. And one stage is his own personal ministry as a prophet, which itself has two stages, as we're going to see. But that's not going to bring life to the exilic community. It's going to bring the exilic community together. It will hold them together as a body that is identifiable as the kind of people that listen to the prophet, even though they don't really believe him. But it's not giving them life yet. The life-giving comes as the prophetic word is nearly independent of the prophet himself. And I think it's a matter of saying it is the prophetic book rather than the prophet himself that is going to make the real difference. And it's not that there's one stage of failure followed by a stage of success. It's rather there's an initial stage of bringing the bodies together, and Ezekiel's prophetic ministry was successful in that respect. It wasn't a failure, but it didn't lead to life. That took place in a second stage with the prophetic book. And one of the things that is characteristic of the book of Ezekiel is how self-consciously it is a book. More so, arguably, than any of the prophetic books preceding Ezekiel. And so we have to look at both the ministry of the prophet himself as reflected in the book and the ministry of the book. What does the book as a book do? at a later stage for another generation in exile. So what did Ezekiel's prophetic ministry look like? As I said, he was deported from Jerusalem in 597 and was involved in ways we don't know in that community in Tel Aviv, from which the modern city Tel Aviv has taken its name, which is probably a resettlement, because Tel is the name for an abundant place where things have grown over old layers of destruction, and Aviv means spring. So it looks like they've been settled there to rebuild a community in that place on the Kebar Canal. And about 4 years later, it was a very interesting time. A lot of diplomatic activity happening. The king of Jerusalem, Zedekiah, came to Babylon on a mission, presumably to ingratiate himself with King Nebuchadnezzar, negotiate a better deal or whatever, while the surrounding nations, the Moabites, the Ammonites and the Edomites and so on, were negotiating about a combined uprising, rebellion against King Nebuchadnezzar. Obviously the Babylonians were a massive superpower at that time. Not one of those nations could simply rebel against them, but there were, this was not the first occasion, several attempts for them to liaise with each other and shake off that yoke of being subservient to the Babylonians. So it was a time that surely the people in exile were aware of, this diplomatic activity, where they were getting their hopes up. Maybe a better deal would come out, maybe there